So guys, in case you've forgotten, the Supreme Court is deeply, deeply conservative leaning. And that means that they make insane rulings. And today they made one of the more insane ones. Which is, well, let's keep purging Virginia's voter rolls. like this is an actually insane decision here, okay? The Supreme Court's conservative majority on Wednesday left in place Virginia's purge of voter registrations that the state says is aimed at stopping people who are not U.S. citizens from voting. And as we covered in a story yesterday, the people who are being targeted on the voter rolls are just people with Hispanic-sounding names. That's it. They're not confirmed non-citizens. They're just people that volunteers for conservative ops deem suspicious on the basis of their names. Surely there has to be a time limit on that, one would think. One Virginian, whose registration was canceled despite living in the state her entire life, called the purge a very bad October surprise. They granted an emergency appeal from Virginia's Republican administration led by Governor Glenn Youngkin, and the court provided no rationale for its action. You don't say. They didn't even bother justifying their ruling. They just did it. Okay, guys? And this is what makes Donald Trump so dangerous. And I know some people on the left have been lulled into a sense of complacency here that, like, oh, the Supreme Court, we haven't heard from them in a while. They're just, they're just, eating shrimp or whatever. They're dominated by conservatives. They are bought and paid for. We've literally had story after story about how conservative justices are taking hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars from billionaire politicians as friendly gifts, okay? We've had stories about how Supreme Court justices had their wives directly involved in the attempt to overthrow democracy on January 6th. There have been no repercussions whatsoever. They've given the position of the president complete and utter immunity from basically any kind of prosecution. And this has a potential to be completely abused going forward here. The justices acted on Virginia's appeal after a federal judge found that the state illegally purged more than 1,600 voter registrations in the past 2 months. A federal appeals court had previously allowed the judge's order to remain in effect. Yeah. And honestly, the AP's coverage of this is abhorrent to me as well. The specter of immigrants voting illegally has been a main part of the political messaging this year from former President Donald Trump and other Republicans, even though such voting is rare in American elections. And it's like, this has been the mainstay of Republican messaging on elections for like 40 goddamn years. It's not just this election cycle. It's every election cycle. And you know what? They've had decades upon decades upon decades to actually prove that it's an issue, and it's just not. Because they don't have the evidence. They've put commissions together. They have given attorneys general broad, sweeping authority to investigate these claims, and they have never been able to substantially validate their premise that millions of undocumented immigrants are illegally voting. Or even millions of non-citizen voters are illegally voting. Or even that millions of, American voters are illegally voting. They haven't been able to prove a single claim that substantial numbers of people are voting illegally. Here. Rena Shaw, 22, of Chesterfield, Virginia, said she was born in Virginia, has lived in the state her whole life, and has never left the U.S. Shaw thinks she may have forgotten to check a citizenship box on a form when she was updating her voter registration at the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles while getting her learner's permit. My first reaction was that this was just ridiculous, and it shouldn't have been allowed in October of all months. It should have been something that happened 6 months before the election rather than on the eve of it, she said. Because again, yeah, if it happens right before the election, there's not really much you can do about it in some states, you know? We're really right up against the election. It's less than a week out, guys. The National Voter Registration Act requires a 90-day quiet period ahead of elections for the maintenance of voter rolls so that legitimate voters are not removed from the rolls by bureaucratic errors or last-minute mistakes that cannot be quickly corrected. Youngkin issued his order on August 7th, the 90th day before the November 5th election. It required daily checks of data from the Department of Motor Vehicles against voter rolls to identify people who are not U.S. citizens. It's really crazy. One example is Nadra Wilson, who lives in Lynchburg, Virginia, and told NPR she got swept up in the purge. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a citizen, Wilson said, before showing her American passport as proof of her citizenship. I know it might not seem like a big deal. Oh, it's only 1,600 votes, right? But that's how the Republicans do it. That's how they do it on every level. You know, they chip away here, they chip away there. They take small bites out of your voter rights. You know, they throw one tiny wrench in that gear, one in that one. And soon, it turns out that they've shaved off enough votes to effectively gerrymander a state. 1,600 votes is a lot. That can mean the difference between winning or losing a county. It can mean, it is one of these things where it's like, there's no justification for this. And if there was, the SCOTUS would have included it. They couldn't even bother to think of one. So, anyway, they're doing their best to run away with this election, folks, on every single level of civic engagement. And it cannot be allowed to succeed.